Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesday, and this is the first episode of 2026. And I wanted to start the year by slowing things down and getting a bit personal instead of chasing the latest talking points. At the end of last year, I spent some time reading a few books that really stopped me in my tracks. And it wasn't because they offered some mind-blowing diet or new protocol, but it was really because they challenged something much deeper and something that I've been personally working through the last couple years. The story that we've been told about discipline, control, and women's bodies. There is a reason women's bodies change across the lifespan, and it actually has very little to do with willpower, discipline, or personal failure. In the book, Why Women Need Fat, evolutionary biologists William Lassick and Stephen Gaulin, Gaulin, make the case that in most modern conversations about women's weight, they're funnily misinformed. And that's not because women are doing something wrong, but because we've built our expectations on a misunderstanding of what female bodies are actually designed to do. So a major part of their argument focuses on how industrialization has radically altered the balance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the modern food supply, particularly through, drumroll, seed oils and ultra-processed foods. And they make a compelling case that this shift is what plays a role in the rising obesity and metabolic dysfunction at the population level. And I agree that this imbalance matters. And that topic, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, deserves an episode of its own. But at the same time, I don't think that explains every woman's story. Diet composition can influence metabolism for sure, but it cannot override prolonged stress, illness, hormonal disruption, nervous system dysregulation, or years of restriction. And in my own case, omega-6 intake outside of naturally occurring sources is relatively low. And that does not account for the changes that I've experienced in my own physique. And that matters because it reminds us that biology is layered. There's no single variable that explains a complex adaptive system. And one of the most important ideas in the book, Why Women Need Fat, is that fat distribution matters more than fat quantity. So let's say that again. The fat distribution matters. So where it's distributed around your body matters more than how much fat you have. And so we all know that women do not store fat in the same way that men do. A significant portion of female body fat is stored in the hips and thighs, and that's known as gluteofemoral fat. This fat is metabolically distinct from abdominal or visceral fat. It's more stable, less inflammatory, and relatively enriched in long-chain fatty acids, including DHA, which plays a key role in fetal brain development. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. Human infants are born with unusually large, energy-hungry brains. Women evolved to carry nutritional resources in reserves that could support pregnancy and lactation even during times of scarcity. In that context, having fat on your lower body was not a flaw or a failure, but it was insurance. And so if we're thinking from this perspective, fat is not excess energy, it is deferred intelligence, stored in anticipation of future need. And this is where waist to hip ratio enters the conversation. Because across cultures and historical periods, a lower waist to hip ratio in women has been associated with reproductive health, metabolic resilience, and successful pregnancies. And this is not about thinness, aesthetics, or moral worth. I'm trying to stress this is about fat function, not about fear of having fat on our bodies, and about how different tissues behave metabolically inside the body. So it's about where the fat is stored and how it functions, because in today's modern culture, we have lost that distinction. Instead of asking what kind of fat a woman carries, we became obsessed with how much. Instead of understanding fat as a tissue with purpose, we've turned it into a moral scoreboard. Hips, that became a problem. Thighs, well, that became something to shrink. Curves became something to discipline. And another central idea of the book, Why Women Need Fat, is the concept biological set point. And this is a scientific theory that suggests that the human body has a predetermined weight or fat mass range. And so the authors argue that women's bodies tend to defend a natural weight range, say that 5 times fast, weight range. And being adequately nourished and not under chronic stress is crucial for the maintenance of that natural biological set point. And when women remain below that range through restriction, overexercise, or prolonged underfueling, the body does not interpret that as success. It didn't get that iPhone update. It's much slower, the evolutionary processing here. It interprets starvation as a threat. Over time, the body adapts, and that's not out of defiance, but it's more out of protection. Your metabolism slows, hunger and fullness cues become unreliable, hormonal systems compensate. When the pressure finally eases, weight will often rebound, sometimes beyond where it started, because the body is trying to restore safety. So from this perspective, midlife weight gain, post-illness weight gain, post-injury, or weight gain after years of restriction is not mysterious, and it's not rebellion, it's regulation. And none of this is taught to women. Instead, we're told that if our bodies change, we failed. That aging, well, in today's day and age, it's optional. That discipline and Botox should override biology. That the number on the scale tells the whole story. So, before we talk about culture, family, trauma, or personal experience, because we're going to get into all of that, I want to say that women's bodies are not designed to stay static. They're designed to adapt. And once you understand that, everything in this conversation changes. So why the body became the battlefield in the first place? This is where historian Joan Jacobs Broomberg's work, The Body Project, An Intimate History of American Girls, provides essential context, but it requires some precision here. Girls have not always been free from shame. Shame itself, that's not new. But what has changed is what women are taught to be ashamed of and how that shame operates in daily life. Broomberg asked a question that still feels unresolved today. Why is the body still a girl's nemesis? Shouldn't these sexually liberated girls feel better about themselves than their corseted counterparts a century ago? Based on extensive historical research, including diaries written by American girls from the 1830s to the 1990s, Broomberg shows that although girls today enjoy more formal freedoms and opportunities, they're also under more pressure and at greater psychological risk. And this is due to a unique convergence of biological vulnerability and cultural forces that turned the adolescent female body into a central site of social meaning during the 20th century. So we're going to break that down. In the late 19th and earliest 20th centuries, so we're talking the late 1800s, early 1900s, girls did not typically grow up fixated on thinness, calorie control, or constant appearance monitoring. Their diaries were not filled with measurements or food rules. Instead, they wrote primarily, now, this isn't to say they weren't concerned about this, but they were very much focused on character, self restraint, moral development, relationships, and their roles within family and community. One 1892 diary entry reads, "Resolved not to talk about myself or feelings, to think before speaking, to work seriously, to be self-restrained in conversation and in actions, not to let my thoughts wander, to be dignified, interest myself more in others." In earlier eras, female shame was more tied to behavior, sexuality, obedience, and virtue. The body mattered, but primarily more as like a moral symbol rather than an aesthetic project requiring constant surveillance and correction. That dramatically changed in the 20th century. Broomberg documents how the mother-daughter connection loosened, particularly around menstruation, sexuality, and bodily knowledge. There was once a time where female relatives and mentors once guided girls through these transitions, but now it's doctors, advertisers, popular media, and the scientific authority increasingly stepping in to fill that role. And at the same time, there was mass media, advertising, film, the medicalized beauty standards that were creating this new and increasingly exacting ideal of physical perfection. Changing norms around intimacy and sexuality also shifted the meaning of virginity, turning it from this like central moral value into an outdated or irrelevant one. What replaced it was not freedom from scrutiny, but a different kind of pressure altogether. By the late 20th century, girls were increasingly taught that their bodies were not merely something they inhabited, but something they were responsible for perfecting. A 1982 diary entry captures this shift starkly. "I will try to make myself better in every way I possibly can with the help of my budget and babysitting money. I will lose weight, get new lenses, already got a new haircut, good makeup, new clothes, and accessories." What changed was not the presence of shame, but its location. It seemed like shame moved inward. Rather than being externally focused through rules and prohibitions, it became more self-policed. Girls were taught to monitor themselves constantly, to evaluate their bodies from the outside, and to treat appearance as the primary expression of identity and worth. Broomberg is explicit on this point. The fact that American girls now make their bodies their central project is not an accident or a cultural curiosity. It is a symptom of historical changes that are the only now beginning to be fully understood. And that's where more recent work, such as Louise Perry's The Case Against Sexual Revolution, helps extend what Broomberg's analysis more into the present moment. Perry argues that while sexual liberation promised autonomy and empowerment, it often left young women navigating powerful biological and emotional realities without the social structures that once offered protection, guidance, or meaning. So in that vacuum, the body became one of the few remaining sites where control still seemed possible. The result is a paradox. Girls are freer in theory, yet more burdened in practice. The body, once shaped by communal norms and shared female knowledge, becomes a solitary project managed under intense cultural pressure and constant comparison. For many girls, this self-surveillance does not begin with magazines or social media. It actually begins at home, absorbed through tone, comments, and modeling made from the women closest to them. Broomberg argues that body dissatisfaction is often transmitted from mother to daughter, and not out of cruelty, but because those mothers inherited the same aesthetic anxieties. Over time, body shame becomes a family inheritance, passed down quietly and persistently. Some mothers transmit it subtly, others do it bluntly. And this matters not because my experience is unique, but I think it illustrates what happens when a body shaped by restriction, stress, and cultural pressure is asked to perform indefinitely. Personal stories are often dismissed as anecdotal, but I think it's where biological theory meets lived reality. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic of from diary entries to digital screens, how beauty ideals have been sexualized over time, I've linked a later podcast that I did maybe almost 2 years ago now. So I might not even agree with everything in there these days, but it's there. It's linked in the show notes. Please check that out. Would love to hear your thoughts. So where it all began, the messages that shaped us. So I grew up in a household where my body was not simply noticed, it was scrutinized, compared, and commented on. Comments like that, they do not fade with time. They shape how you see yourself in mirrors and in photographs. They teach you that your body must be managed and monitored, and they plant the belief that staying small is the price of safety. So podcast listeners, in the blog, I have some photos of myself as a little girl. So I grew up believing that if I could control my body well enough, I could avoid humiliation. I could avoid becoming the punchline. I could avoid being seen in the wrong way. And for a while, I turned that fear into discipline. The years before the collapse, a lifetime of restriction and survival. So food never felt simple for me. Long before bodybuilding, chronic pain, or long COVID, I carried a strained relationship with eating. Growing up near constant state of anxiety meant that hunger cues often felt unpredictable, and eating was something to plan around or to push through. It rarely felt intuitive or easy for me. And because of this, I experimented with diets that replaced real meals with cereal or shakes. I followed plans like the Special K diet, or I relied on Carnation instant breakfast instead of eating solid food. My protein intake was always low. My fear of gaining weight was always high, and restriction became very familiar. There's some photos here, and I captioned them, but there's a photo of my very early days working out on the stair climber when I'm 16 years old. It's wild. So in college, I became a strict vegetarian out of compassion for animals, which I still carry, but I did not understand how to meet my nutritional needs. I was studying dietetics at the time, so I was learning about it, and I was earning personal training certifications while running a lot. I think I was running 50 to 60 miles per week and lifting weights at the gym, listening to Salt and Pepper on the elliptical all the time, using exercise as a way to maintain control. And from the outside, sure, I looked disciplined, but internally, my relationship with food and exercise remained tense and inconsistent. Later on in life, I became involved with that meal replacement program. You've heard about it before if you listen regularly to the podcast, which was a multi-level marketing company. I replaced 2 meals a day with shakes, so it felt very, very familiar to what I used to do in high school, and practiced intermittent fasting framed as quote-unquote cleanse days. So in hindsight, this was just structured under eating presented as wellness, and it fit seamlessly into the patterns that I had lived for years. Like I said, eating often felt overwhelming for me, and cooking felt like a hurdle. Certain textures bothered me. My appetite felt fragile and unreliable. And the sensory sensitivity existed long before I developed parosmia. From earlier on, food was often shaped by stress rather than nourishment when I reflect back. And during this period in college, I was also on hormonal birth control. First it was the NuvaRing and later the Mirena IUD. And this was for nearly a decade. And so long-term hormonal modulation can also influence mood, inflammation, appetite, and weight distribution. I think this added another layer of complexity to my system that was already under strain. So now that I look back, like I mentioned, and I can see my teens and 20s, they were marked by nearly constant restriction. The restriction, I guess, felt normal. Thriving did not. And so when the book Why Women Need Fat discusses this idea of biological weight set point, the range that the body tends to return to when conditions are stable and adequately nourished, I now understand that I remained below my natural set point for years through force rather than balance. My biology never really experienced consistency or safety. And this landscape is what I carried into my 30s. The body that I built is the body that broke. And so by the time I entered the bodybuilding world in 2017 and 2018, I already had chronic years of undereating, overexercising, and nutrient gaps behind me. Bodybuilding did not create the issues, but it definitely amplified them. I competed in 4 shows. People admired the discipline and the physique. Internally, my body was weakening. I was overtraining. I was undereating. So by 2019, my immune system began to fail. I developed severe canker sores all over my mouth, tongue, sometimes 20 or more at once. Talking, drinking water, everything was very painful. I started noticing weight loss resistance. Everything I'd done in the past was no longer working. On my 35th birthday, I got shingles. That was painful. My energy crashed. My emotional bandwidth was narrowing. My body was asking for rest, but I did not know how to slow down. And if you want to hear a deeper dive into my bodybuilding journey, I linked an older episode, Fit for TV, how screens, diet culture, and reality shows rewire our brains and bodies. So around this time, I was also navigating eating disorder recovery. I enrolled in that in 2020. Learning how to eat intuitively without panic or rigid control was emotionally exhausting, even under ideal circumstances. But little did I know things were about to take a massive turn for the worse, because now we've got COVID, we've got lockdowns, we've got mandates, and I got sick with the vid late 2020, and that's when everything shifted. I developed parosmia, which was a smell and taste distortion that made many of my foods taste rotten or chemical. Protein and cooked foods often taste spoiled. Herbs, they smelled more like artificial chemical. Eating became distressing and at a lot of times freaking impossible. My appetite dropped significantly. There were periods where my intake was so very low, yet my weight continued to rise. This is not uncommon following illness or prolonged stress. The body often shifts into energy conservation, prioritizing survival over weight regulation. So weight gain for me has become another source of grief. Roughly 30 pounds over the next 5 years since then. I feel embarrassed, and now I avoid photographs. I often worry about how others will perceive me. And if this experience resonates, I think it's important to say this clearly. Your body's not betraying you. This is the message I'm taking into 2026. It's responding to stress, illness, and prolonged strain in the way the bodies are designed to respond. So why women's bodies adapt instead of just bounce back? It's so important to understand when years of restriction, intense exercise, chronic stress, illness, hormonal shifts, and emotional trauma accumulate, the body often is going to enter a protective state. Metabolism is going to maybe slow down. Thyroid issues are often correlated with all of this. Hormonal signaling is shifting. Hunger cues become unreliable. The leptin-ghrelin relationship has often shifted. Weight gain or resistance to weight loss can even occur during periods of low intake because energy regulation is now being driven by survival physiology rather than simple calorie balance. It's so important to understand that this is not failure. This is physiology 101. The calories in, calories out model does not account for thyroid suppression, nervous system activation, sleep disruption, pain, trauma, or metabolic adaptation. It reduces a complex biological system into simple arithmetic. And I've said on past episodes before, your fat cells do not have a calculator. They're not like boop, 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 boop. You know, women's bodies, we're not machines. We are adaptive systems built for survival. And sometimes resilience is going to look like holding on to energy when the body does not feel safe. Linked in the show notes are a ton of previous episodes. Metabolism myth, why dieting fails. We talked about earn the right to diet, I think the beginning of last year. The system that reinforces shame. So examples of negative body image behaviors. We have avoidant, avoiding buying new clothes. Oh, this is what I'm struggling with. Avoiding mirrors, avoiding social gatherings, intentionally hiding parts of your body. Conflictual, constantly battling your body and telling it needs to be something that it's not. Abusive, calling yourself names, starving yourself intentionally, exercising to the point of exhaustion, and other self-harm. So I definitely used to struggle with that one. Despite this biological reality, we live in a culture that ties women's value to discipline and appearance. When women gain weight, even under extreme circumstances, we blame ourselves before questioning the system. Diet culture frames shrinking as virtue. Toxic positivity encourages acceptance without context. Industrial food environments differ radically from those our ancestors evolved in. Medical systems often dismiss women's pain and metabolic complexity. And social media will amplify comparison and moralizes body size, and none of this is your fault. And all of it shapes our experiences. And this is why understanding the science matters. This is why telling the truth matters. And this is why sharing stories matters. Linked in the podcast blog is beyond the before and after the truth about social media and body image, an interview we did with some body image researchers. So in closing, I'm not sure if you've heard about the book More Than a Body by Lindsay and Lexi Kite, but they describe how women are taught to relate to themselves through constant self-monitoring. Instead of living inside our bodies, we learn to watch ourselves from the outside. We assess how we look, how we are perceived, and whether our bodies are acceptable in any given moment. This constant self-surveillance does real harm. It pulls attention away from hunger, pain, fatigue, and intuition. It trains women to override bodily signals in favor of appearance management. And over time, it creates a split where the body is treated as a project to control rather than a system to understand or care for. When you layer this kind of self-objectification on top of chronic stress, restriction, illness, and trauma, the result is not empowerment, but it's more like disconnection. And disconnection makes it even harder to hear what the body needs and when something is wrong. So weight gain is not just a biological response, it now becomes a moral verdict. And that is how women end up fighting bodies that are already struggling just to keep them alive. So the inheritance ends here. For a long time, I believed that breaking generational cycles only applied to mothers and daughters, and I don't have children, so I assumed that I inherited would simply just end with me unchanged. But Broomberg's work helped me see this differently. What we inherit is not just passed down only through parenting. It moves through tone, silence, and self-talk. It appears in how women speak about their bodies in front of others. It lives in the way shame is normalized. So I inherited a legacy of body shame. Even on the days when I still feel its weight, I am choosing not to repeat it. For me, the inheritance ends with telling the truth about this journey and refusing to speak to my body with the same cruelty I absorbed growing up. It ends here. So I wish I could end this with a simple story of resolution, but I cannot. I'm still in the middle of this, and I still grieve. I still struggle with eating, and with my sciatica for the last couple months, I struggle with regular movement. I get an MRI really soon, so keep me in your thoughts. I'm still learning how to inhabit a body that feels very unfamiliar. But I know this, my body is not my enemy. And she's not malfunctioning, but she's adapting to a lifetime of stress, illness, restriction, and emotional weight. So if you happen to be in a similar place, I hope this offers permission to stop fighting yourself and start understanding the patterns your body is following. Not because everything will suddenly improve, but because clarity is often the first form of compassion. Your body is not betraying you. She is keeping you here. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit that we are still finding our way. But by changing the way you think about your body, you open the door to limitless possibilities for what your current self can experience. And with that, that's all I have for today's episode. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you have not yet left a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple, please do so. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure you hit like and subscribe. If you're on Substack, also subscribe. And thank you guys all so much. Happy New Year and happy Embolic, which is coming up on February 1st and 2nd. And I look forward to the next episode. When that will be, I am not sure. But until then, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a good one.